Greetings, traveler. In this video, we're going to talk about how to create your own Dungeons & Dragons adventures, and to take it a step further, how to create your own game systems similar to Dungeons & Dragons or vastly different. My name is Xanthos. I've been working in the games industry for the last 13 years, and this podcast is my way of sharing everything I've learned. So if you're someone who walks the path of making games, this one is for you. So in the previous two episodes, we talked about what Dungeons & Dragons is, why it's relevant to game designers, and how to become a dungeon master in a Dungeons & Dragons game. Also in the first episode of the series, we talked about why Dungeons & Dragons is so important to game designers and how it can improve the way you create video games or other types of games in the future. So let's begin. Up to now, you've probably played some Dungeons & Dragons, you have run a couple of your own sessions or campaigns based on published adventures, material that's already out there and that you could just pick up, read information on adventure. I mentioned last time the example of a village that has a magical plague on it, and the players are tasked with the objective of removing or lifting the plague. And you can see how the published adventures can help you quickly learn the information about the world, use all the material there for what to tell the players, how to hook them into the adventure, how to present the monsters, what the resolution of the adventure is, and so on. Now, chances are, if you're working on your own game design skills, you will want to know how in the future you can create your own video games or other tabletop games or anything really, using the same elements or the same tools that you used for running your own Dungeons & Dragons adventures. Namely, these can be how to set the world, how to present the story, how to make the players care. When the players try to do this or that action, like swing a sword or pick a lock or punch a monster or something, how that works mechanically. You have been exposed to the way Dungeons & Dragons does these things, or if you have been playing a different type of tabletop game, how that kind of game does these things. So by now, the great benefit that you have achieved is that you have in your mind an example of how this can work. There is a very specific sequence of actions, and you know how that would work in the world of that particular game. And now you have all the tools you need to start tweaking it. So let's take a look at how you can tweak the world, how you can change everything about the world, maybe going from a typical Dungeons & Dragons setting, which is very broadly similar to Lord of the Rings, to something entirely different, like cyberpunk type of adventure or an ancient Greece type of adventure. Really, anything you can think of is a possibility you can create. So from the last video, when we talked about the Dungeon Master's Guide for this particular version of Dungeons & Dragons, we talked about this section, creating a multiverse. So the creators of D&D essentially expect you to customize your game in one way or another. And this comes very useful when you want to create a video game set in an entirely different setting, let's say a 1920s London kind of setting. So you know how you would create it for fantasy setting. So you know what the necessary elements are. For example, a city, the people who live in it, the jobs they do, the problems they have, how the city functions, what people care about, what preconceptions they have, what sort of things they celebrate, what do they do for fun, what do they do for their professions, how do they make money. So all these things are general templates and lenses through which you can look at any given setting. So perhaps in Lord of the Rings, people are supposed to make money by hunting or being a guard in front of an important person's estate. Well, already this is an example you can use in a 1920s London kind of setting as well. But something that would be different, for example, is that most people in that setting probably don't hunt for a living. Probably they're working at the docks, or they're carpenters or builders, or they do more shady things. It depends on what kind of story you want to tell. So now that you have this framework, you can start playing around with it. The book will give you an excellent starting point, and from then on, all you have to do really is to go in and give it a try. If you have already played a published adventure for your players, if you have already run that game, then you can try running your favorite kind of game, let's say in the 20s London example, and see what reaction that gets from your players. You will very likely feel that it's a bit different than running the published adventures. Perhaps the theme is quite different, or perhaps the mentality of the world is quite different. It's more serious, or it's more dark, or it's more lighthearted and funny than a typical D&D adventure. Although that might be unlikely. But you will notice some differences. And that is a good thing. That shows you how you need to slightly tweak the way you introduce the world to your players to make them feel part of it and understand what the struggle of that world is, and how you can gradually introduce more elements for drawing them in. Another great resource for finding out more things you can introduce into your world is a book like this, Something Monster Manual. So this book is similar to the spells chapter in the Player's Handbook that I mentioned 2 episodes ago, where you have nothing but spells and all these long descriptions about how each spell works and what it does and what it needs and so on. Well, this book has nothing but monsters. So typically it will have a description about a monster, and then its statistics, what attacks it has, and what hit points it has, and what's the progression, and what its behavior is, and so on. Additionally, a resource that's extremely useful for dungeon masters who want to heavily customize the world or the game is information on common animals, so animals like deer or dogs and so on, which are likely part of your world as well. And also there is information here about how to customize a monster, so how to make it stronger or weaker, or perhaps give it different flavor, so a fire dog or an angel shark, or any sort of crazy thing you can think of. And that's great news, because when the time comes to convert, let's say, an existing Dungeons and Dragons monster to a monster or a challenge that would likely exist in your world, you have most of the elements you need to get started already. So let's look at a very simple example. Let's say in your 1920s London example, you have a story about a detective and his close buddies investigating a scientist who seems to be creating monster-like creatures. He's playing around with genetics, and he's doing crazy experiments, and he's causing trouble, all sorts of trouble for the city. So immediately you might think, well, okay, if I ran that adventure, where on earth am I supposed to find the statistics, the strength score, and the hit points, and how much damage the attacks do for this crazy horror aberration that the mad scientist is supposed to be creating. It's a very daunting task, and thankfully the easy mode of doing it is to just reference the book. My recommendation for designing a monster like that and assigning hit points and stats and a strength score and attacks and so on is, if possible, find an existing monster inside the player's handbook, inside the monster manual of whatever edition you have access to, and if possible use it as is in your game. Change the name and change the description so that it's appropriate for your world, but otherwise, unless necessary, don't worry about changing its stats. That's the easiest mode you can do this in. The slightly less straightforward way to do it is to slightly tweak it to be even more appropriate for your world. So an example of that would be, let's say that crazy monster that the scientist has created in your world is very powerful, and you look at the book and you don't see a monster that's both formless and an aberration, and at the same time strong enough to challenge the players at their current level. So in that case, what you can do is you can pick a monster that is the appropriate challenge, which I think is the most difficult thing to match in this kind of design challenge, and then change its theme to suit what you're going for. So perhaps the most appropriate monster for your group level might be the same as a dragon inside the monster manual. And of course, the dragon is a very different thing from a formless aberration with 17 hands and 35 feet. And that's completely fine. Then you will have to do all the little tweaks that are necessary to make sure that what started out as a dragon inside the monster manual ends up as a crazy aberration for your world. So you will most likely have to only change the description of the appearance of the monster and remove one or two attacks that the dragon would typically have and add one or two attacks that your creature would typically have. So you might want to take away the dragon breath from your monster and replace it with, let's say, trample attack as the aberration charges the players, or perhaps a grappling attack where the creature tries to snatch a character with one of its tentacles and crush him to death, for example. So thankfully there's a lot of examples inside the book about such attacks and such monsters. So no matter how out there the concept you have for your monster is, there is something to help you get started or do all the heavy lifting for you. So that covers how to customize the world and customize the monsters to serve the world that you have in mind. But what about the question of creating your own game system? That's similar to Dungeons & Dragons, or it's very much different from it. Well, the more you play Dungeons & Dragons, the more you will notice this theme that there is inspiration from a very specific kind of place. So in the case of Dungeons & Dragons, it's something like Lord of the Rings. In your case, it might be, let's say, a war game, maybe something from the Second World War, or it might be gang wars in the 1920s London example. Just like with Lord of the Rings, the designers had to look at the concept of the world and of the adventure and break it down into components. So you would need a world where hobbits and elves and dwarves should exist. So the creators had to come up with rules for hobbits and elves and dwarves or similar creatures in the Dungeons & Dragons world. Moreover, there is certain actions, certain heroic adventures that are done in that setting that you want to replicate in your game. So shooting a bow, swinging a sword, casting a spell, fighting a monster, What these things would look like in your world depends up to you, but at least you have an example of how they work in Dungeons and Dragons. So one thing to look closely at here is, for example, magic. In Dungeons and Dragons, there are several classes that use magic, but they're all quite different from each other. The way they cast spells and the way they recover them and the way magic functions for them is different from one class to the other. This will give you very good hints about how to customize this kind of resource that the players use to achieve what they want in the world. So in your 1920s London example, perhaps there is no magic and there are no swords, but there's pistols perhaps. So when you're looking at a pistol, you might think, well, a pistol is essentially an evolution of the bow, or more specifically the crossbow. So then you can think, how is a crossbow different from a pistol? Well, it's smaller, it's lighter, and depending on the level of technology it uses, it can be stronger or weaker than a crossbow. So there you already have some very specific ways to customize the crossbow example from the player's handbook, let's say, to make it into a pistol. Now, thankfully, that specific conversion is already provided as a sample in the Dungeon Master's Guide for most editions that I'm aware of. So that's a good place to start from to see how they did that conversion. And then you can take it further to whatever other ability or weapon or monster you have in mind. And you might think, wait a minute, how do all these things make me capable of creating my own game system? Well, once you get to the nuts and bolts of the game system, you see that it's composed out of very, very simple components that are replicated all over the place. Dungeons and Dragons is referred to sometimes as a D20 system because you use a 20-sided die to decide the outcome of most actions, attacks, skill checks, and so on. So before you talk about classes, before you talk about spells, and before you talk about adventures and so on, you have the basic mechanic where someone wants to do something and the outcome of that action is decided by the result of a 20-sided die with modifiers for how good that person that is in that action and how difficult the action is to achieve. So in a very simple way, if the action, as mentioned in the book, is very easy to achieve, then rolling 5 or above on the 20-sided die is enough to say that you achieve the action, you are successful. If it's a 50-50 task, well, you have to roll at least a 10 or above, and so on. Or if your character is fighting a very, very strong enemy and it's very difficult to even land a hit, perhaps to hit the enemy you need a 15 and above. So you can see how with a single mechanic, Dungeons and Dragons expresses the action that you want to take and how that action is successful or not successful. That is because it specifically wants to model all the grand adventures in Lord of the Rings or other similar fantasy tales and let you play them as well. Now, in your case, perhaps the actions are the main point, perhaps the conversations are the main point, perhaps you don't want to use dice at all and you want to have a very fixed system based on numbers. Or perhaps your game is not about sword play or gunslinging and so on. It's about deception and conversations and espionage. So then you would think, well, how would a spy sneak into a mansion of a rival family, for example? That action in itself doesn't include any gunslinging and so on, but even though it's possible to express in a D&D way, it's also possible to express in your own way as well. So let's say in that case, then that player uses their social network. So based on their social network, they will have to role play with other players or other non-playable characters in the world and collect a number of clues about how to infiltrate the mansion. Every clue, let's say, could count as an advantage. And in this system that doesn't use dice, you need at least 5 advantages to be able to successfully infiltrate the mansion. And the advantages, or the clues rather, could take the form of don't use the left side of the house because there is a dog there. Make sure you have a screwdriver with you because it's going to be easier to undo the lock on the window. Make sure you wear pointed shoes so they help you climb the bricks on the side of the wall more easily, for example. So as long as your character collects, let's say, 5 of those, then they can achieve the task. If they have 4 of those, you can set a system where you achieve the task, but you have some disadvantage going forward. So you injured yourself, so maybe you cannot use your left arm for the rest of the adventure. Or if you have 3 or fewer advantages, you don't succeed at the task at all, and maybe the guards get alerted. And conversely, having more advantages can give you more amazing results. So having 10 advantages, so the game rewarding you for taking the time to role play this information gathering heavy style game, is if you gather 10 advantages, not only you easily infiltrate your target, the mansion, but as soon as you get inside, you are face to face with the person you were looking for altogether. So you get a much better result, or you're face to face with a grand treasure that was in the house that wasn't your objective, but it's nice to have, right? So the customization ways for these are endless, and the more you go down this hole and the more you expose these custom systems to your players and get their feedback, which is a very important way of testing all your ideas, the more you gain confidence, and the more you start saying that, well, all that stuff I did for D&D or for my own tabletop system, this is very easily transferable to a video game and that system as well. And then is when you unlock a huge way of having fun with this, and your confidence in putting together new systems and new worlds seriously skyrockets. So that's it for today. If you know someone who is currently in that process of struggling to make their own system, or they're feeling overwhelmed with how to deal with all this vast amount of information and they don't know where to start, feel free to share this video with them if it helps. And thank you for your time. As always, have fun.